Thanks, Wayne. So I think our job is to wake you up this morning. So hope everyone had a good night last night. I know I did. So if we can have the slides up, that would be great. There we go. So what I'm going to be talking to you about is what we've been doing at CMS about creating really an ecosystem for data-driven healthcare, where the patient is actually in control of their own data. I know that's a radical concept, but that's really what we've been building. And I'm really excited to have Anne-Marie with me because of the work that Karen Alliance is doing in really extending what we've done. So Anne-Marie, if you'd like to say just a few words about what you're doing at the Karen Alliance.
Sure. So in many ways, it builds off of exactly what Mark is talking about with the Blue Button 2.0 data. What the Karen Alliance is convening is a work group around payers and patient groups and entities who are exceptionally interested in making sure that consumers have access to their healthcare data. And we are developing a common payer data set that we can then translate into FHIR so that patients and consumers have access to their healthcare records. And it builds off of Blue Button 2.0 in that it is taking it from the fee-for-service Medicare plans to Medicare Advantage to individual market plans to Medicaid MCOs and asking them to either meet or exceed the Blue Button data. So thanks, Mark.
And that is really awesome. So I really encourage that. So what did we set out to do at CMS with Blue Button, what's now known as Blue Button 2? I was in Nashville earlier this week at a geek conference and said, who's in healthcare? And I had like one person put their hand up. So I'm going to ask a different question. Who's heard of Blue Button? Right, okay, so we've got them awake. This is really good. So I don't really need to tell you much, but it's been around for years, but every implementation was different. So I actually got invited into CMS as an entrepreneur in residence. They now call me the CMS Blue Button Innovator. And our vision statement that we set out on the very first day on the project with Niall Brennan was to build a developer-friendly, standards-based data API that enables beneficiaries to connect their data to the applications, services, or research programs they trust, okay? And what was really rewarding was at HIMSS in March, the CMS administrator, Seema Verma, stood up in front of a pretty large audience and basically recited that same vision statement. That's what we've delivered with Blue Button 2.0. And I know there were some great demos yesterday, including, is Randy here? You stole most of my thunder yesterday, because there's a group of you that are already in our API and in some cases actually in production. So the reason we were able to do this is really around the HIPAA privacy rules. So we pulled together a bunch of things. One is FHIR. The great work that Graham and the community has done around FHIR is absolutely awesome, and we applaud that. But we had to put together some stuff here, and we were really helped out by the Office of Civil Rights. And I think that's really what's driving Karen Alliance as well, isn't it, Anne-Marie? And the privacy rule, about 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, some guidance was put out, and they basically said two things. One is that you, as a patient, have the right to send your data to a party that you want it to go to, okay, to a third party. But the other thing that they said is we as patients can do that electronically, okay? So the point we made at CMS is that, well, if you've signed into your patient portal and you've been trusted with seeing some of your health data, then that's the equivalent of a digital signature. If you don't believe that's good enough, if you're running a portal, and you don't think that's good enough as a signature for a user, then shut your portal down, right? So we took those and we embedded that. So what we built is consumer-directed exchange sitting on top of an OAuth 2.0 authorization layer, and then on top of the FHIR data resources, okay? So what we've delivered is patient coverage and explanation of benefit resources, but I'm looking forward to Karen Alliance extending that.
Right, so I was going to add on to this that this is a really important and distinctive feature of this, because right now we've seen that medical records are exchanged among your healthcare providers through business-to-business interactions with electronic vendors. This really changes that in that it gives the consumer the power to share it or not share it with any of the providers of their choosing. And so it's definitely a new concept, and it takes it out of HIPAA and those restrictions, puts it under FTC guidance, and really changes the way information flows.
Yeah, so I was actually saying at a conference earlier this week, what we're using here is what's known as the HIPAA right of access. And that means that if you want to send your data knowingly to a Russian hacker, you are perfectly at liberty to do so, right? The point being knowingly. So let's move on. So what we've done at CMS is really think about our API as a product, and you as developers are our customers. And if you're not signed up for our API and you are dealing with patients, come talk to me after the break and we'll get you sorted out. So what we did is we set up various personas to try and help folks in understanding the data. And we're constantly listening to you as developers about what your needs are around the data that we're actually able to release. And I'll point one of the things out here. We're dealing with the Medicare community, so that's, older folks like me. And people say, but these folks, they don't deal with technology. And I say, rubbish. So I was at HIMSS. Seema Verma had announced the Blue Button 2.0. My sister saw it on Facebook. She told my mum. My mum FaceTimes me. My mum is 82. And she FaceTimes me in Vegas to say, well done, So the point being, we have a growing community of, senior folks. They don't have to understand how the technology works. That's your job. But they're comfortable using it. They FaceTime their kids. They've got their Fitbits. They're doing all this stuff. So, don't let that be a barrier. So what I'm going to quickly run through is how hard it is for a beneficiary to share their claims data. So imagine this is your app. This is actually a sample from one of the apps in our sandbox. And a beneficiary signs into your app and they see this opportunity to actually share their claims data with you. So that's good. So they click in. Now they have to do the really hard thing, is they have to remember their user ID and password at mymedicare.gov, okay? So they remember to fill this in, and we actually have like a whole bunch of synthetic records, so I can tell you the secret passwords later. Come see me. And so what they'll do is they'll fill in their user ID and password, and they'll click that sign-in button. And then the next thing they're presented with is a page, and you'll see we made it responsive, explaining what they're about to do. They are about to trust you. So this is job one for you folks. You need to build that trust with the patient, because they're sharing their data with you. They're letting it outside this HIPAA boundary. And if they're happy doing that, they're just going to click the allow button. And now they're back in the app, and now you do your magic. Okay? You take that data, the claims data, and you make sense of it for them. Give them actionable insights.
And Mark, I might add on this point that in the Karen Alliance, not only are we bringing together the payers and the patient groups to try and determine which information should be consumer-facing, but we're also working with a number of companies who are trying to facilitate this app development.
Yeah.
And it incorporates Blue Button, it incorporates the upcoming data that we'll have on claims, and ideally, when we get there, the pharmacy benefit as well. Yeah,
so I think, let's say, that the work that Karen Alliance is doing around trying to define what the implementation guide looks like for commercial plans is really great, because the last thing we want as developers is to have 150 different implementations of Blue Button. Then we're back to where we were in 2010. And I can tell you, Randy, you've probably done the same. I remember losing 3 weeks of my life trying to parse that text file out of CMS. We do not want to go there, and that's the beauty of FHIR. It's really helped in moving the bar from trying to work out what is the data to what do I want to do with the data, right? So we were thinking very much about you as we built our API, and so we've got a whole host of documentation. And some of the folks that have gone into our sandbox, our play area, have already said we've done a reasonable job, but we're always happy to get other feedback to see how we can improve it. So the first thing, we can maybe test you at the end, is the URL for this is really hard. It's bluebutton.cms.gov. Okay, so you can just go there and sign up. As developers, you're probably wondering how expensive. We're nowhere near as expensive as some of the EMR vendors out there. Oops, sorry. It's a big fat zero. Okay, that's the cost of using it. It's basically your sweat equity in building the cool stuff you want to do in your apps to use our data. So we have a blog out there. So we've also produced various sample apps. So we write up in the blog about how you can do those installations. We also have a support group on Google Groups, and it's really great. We're actually seeing developers answer other developers' questions now. So that's a really vibrant place. And if you're looking at our data and you see issues with it, that's a great place to go. And we're constantly watching that and seeing how we can improve. So let's move. So I said we've actually created a bunch of sample apps. They're not fancy UIs. We leave that to you folks to develop really cool stuff. But this will get you going in being able to use the OAuth interface, so practice that login by the beneficiary and then start consuming the data. So we've got examples in Node, in Django, Rails, and others. And in fact, these are all open source. You can find them on GitHub today. If you go to the CMS Gov account and look for anything prefix Blue Button. And in fact, everything that we built in that Blue Button API, we built off James Agnew's FHIR server, the Happy server. Everything there is open source, so you can steal whatever you want, right? We've got the deployment scripts, we've got the front end OAuth application, we've got the back end FHIR platform. It's all there. So you might wonder, what have we got? So we've actually got about 8 billion records sitting in a database that is served up via FHIR. So it's I think that's pretty large implementation in the industry. That's data for 53 million beneficiaries. And if you're familiar with the original Blue Button text file, they had 3 years worth of data. Well, when we started the loading process for our API, we basically said, well, we're already doing 3 years, so let's do that. So we did 3 years, but we've been at it for a little while now, and we didn't agree to actually throw any data away. So we're now at 4.5 years, going on for 5. So it's a really good resource, but it is only claims. But that's got diagnosis codes, it's got drug codes and so forth. So we've got, if you're familiar with Medicare, we've got Medicare Part A, that's basically the hospital stuff. You've got Medicare Part B, that's you visit the doctor's office, or you get a wheelchair paid for by Medicare. And you've got Part D, that's the pharmacy. So you wonder, why is C missing? Well, Anne-Marie, that's the Medicare Advantage. We don't have that data through this API. That's right. Why we're really encouraging the Karen Alliance to get those Medicare Advantage plans together and agree what's that implementation look like for basically Medicare Part C.
Right, and I think it's important to note that this is fee-for-service Medicare,
yes.
And there are MA plans, there are individual market plans, there are Medicaid MCO plans, and right now they are not obligated in any way to release this data to consumers. But for those of you who have been following what Seema Verma is doing in My Healthy Data, it is certainly going both regulatorily and statutorily in the direction of requiring those plans to make this type of data available to consumers, both for transparency purposes, both for just having consumers far more engaged. When you think about the other public policy issues that this ties into, things about how you're using your HSA. And so we've gotten a lot of traction from the work that we're doing in Karen with both the regulators in the administration and the legislators.
Yeah, so I think those folks that are engaged now with Karen Alliance are really trying to get ahead of potential regulations. But you can, if you read between the lines of what Seema said at HIMSS and in subsequent speeches, she's really put the industry on notice that, you know, getting data into the hands of consumers is where it's going, and you need to get on board. So you best to get involved now and really drive the bus rather than have to catch up later. So let's dig in a bit more. So what we've actually built here, there's sort of two parts to this. One is if we go to this side, my brain is not working on left or right now. So what we've leveraged, as I've said, is the HIPAA right of access. So once you as a patient have got your data, you can send it wherever you like. If you want to post it on Facebook, go ahead. It's your right. So I'd say the Blue Button 2 API, if you think about it, is the only API in the industry today that will bridge the gap between a covered entity like CMS or your hospital or doctor's office and a non-covered entity. And think about it, where does care happen? It doesn't really happen in the doctor's office. That's about 1% of healthcare. Most of it happens in the home or in the community. And if you're thinking about how do we get information into the hands of the right people to help patients, help you, help caregivers, Blue Button 2 is the only API today that can do that, because we put the patient slap bang in the middle of deciding who they trust to share with. So the other thing that I think we've done in some ways some groundbreaking work is around the consent. You saw the process that we went through there for a beneficiary to sign in and authorize. What I say to you is that think about it. You know these complex consent documents, they usually want you to sign in blood when you go to your doctor's office or whatever, if you want to share information. Well, I'd argue that the data that you need to put on that is like, who do you want to share with, i.e. the application? Who's giving the consent for the sharing? That's you, the patient. What are you sharing? That's the scopes in OAuth about the data that you're choosing to share and for how long, right? So all of that is effectively the consent. And so some of the work we've done at the Connectathons over the last few Connectathons is really driving that point home, that the OAuth 2 authorization from the patient's perspective is effectively consent. And we as an industry really need to leverage that and not make it hard for patients to share their data. So on the left-hand side here, what we've done is use these two components, and I say it's been great working with the FHIR community. So we actually worked with the financial management work group to define the explanation of benefit resource that we put all our data into pretty well. And I say that I do that because I was lazy, and I was also thinking as a developer, I didn't want to put the data into like 17 different resources and then have to work out how do I stitch it together to make sense of it. So we actually worked to help define in Release 3 the explanation of benefit resource. But I'm looking forward to the work around the Karen Alliance and other initiatives to say, let's use the Blue Button 2 mechanism, but let's try and release more and more of these FHIR resources. So if you're a hospital, you could do Blue Button 2 and release the common clinical data set. That would be amazing.
Mark, I'll add, I think that's really exciting to many of our members as well. And as we create each of these implementation guides, I think ultimately we would love to see all of it aggregated in one place so that you have consumers across all of these health plans able to access it right from their phones.
Yeah, and so what we're looking at is basically implementation guides for Blue Button. You know, I'd love to see one for the Medicaid world. We don't want to end up with 53 different implementations of Blue Button for Medicaid for each state. You know, so this is, I think the FHIR community has got a great model about bringing those people together and having these discussions and sorting out, you know, standards, but with some flexibility. So what are we doing on the API front? Well, it's not static. We are continually looking at how we can improve it. And so some of the early stuff that we're working on, you know, probably before the end of the year, we're working on proper native mobile app support in the API. So if you're people like iBlueButton, you know, we'll be looking to you to help us with the development of this. We've had your input as we've evolved the API, and this will be the next thing. We'll be reaching out to you and saying, hey, come on, help us test out Pixie and all these other good things. And then the other stuff we're trying to do to make life easier for you is things like drug code descriptions. So instead of just getting the drug code, we can actually put something that means something. So you have to do less work in making it meaningful for patients. So what have we got in our sandbox? Again, this is all out there. I really should go and look at it and say, where can I point you to all of these records? Because I think they're hiding somewhere on GitHub in our CMS Gov account. But what we did is create these 30,000 synthetic beneficiary records. We do want to do some work with like Cynthia and see if we can really improve these, both this and the provider information that we have in our sandbox. But we've got effectively something like about 2.2 million synthetic claims in this sandbox for you to play with. And as you saw the URL there, sandbox.bluebutton.cms.gov. So what it's about is we've built a pipe. And that pipe, that's really what we're doing, is just releasing data. And we're really trying to put this out there as a product for you as developers. Go and do your magic. Other things that we're doing, though, you'll see in the top left there, research. We mentioned that in the vision statement. We've actually been working with the National Institutes of Health. So their Sync for Science, or their All of Us initiative, we're actually working with them. They've extended that, their data set there to include the explanation benefit resource that we're releasing. And for our side, what we're doing is making sure that you can use a Sync for Science protocol to actually talk to our API. So basically Smart on FHIR and all of those good things. So we're really trying to make it easy. The other thing that's worth pointing out with this that maybe separates us from some of the EMR vendors is that when we give out, when the beneficiary authorizes, we haven't actually set an end time on that. So you can come back and get a refresh token. So from the research perspective, don't let the fact that maybe your patient group that you're looking at doesn't have internet, they don't have a smartphone. I know that's a rarity these days, really, but all you have to do is onboard the patient, and then you can come back every week as we update the data and see if anything has changed. They do not need to be doing anything else to let you have the data. They can always come back to mymedicare.gov and go and revoke your access, all standard OAuth2 stuff, if you're familiar with that. But you can keep coming and getting the data, right? So nothing that the patient has to do. So it's really simple.
So Mark, I'm going to add one other point to that as we talk about authentication. One of the other work streams in Karen is this identity authentication work group, where we've got folks coming together and trying to determine, how do you say you are who you say you are, and how do you increase the comfort level for consumers in being able to download their data and understand who has access to it. You know, I think you're right that folks are increasingly tech savvy, but I do think there's still these lingering questions about how the privacy elements are going to work. Yeah. And, you know, this has really been something that you've put a ton of thought to, and so our goal is really to make sure that providers are just as comfortable as consumers with all of that.
Yeah, so we've done, there's a lot of good stuff going on in the Trust Frame work group at Karen Alliance. And we've actually done some work around designing some protocols. I think we need to put some thought into how, as developers, we can get together and deal with developer friction as these API endpoints proliferate across the industry. The situation we've got now, where you have to go and sign up with each individual endpoint, is just totally not scalable. And we've really got to try and address that. And we need to get together as an industry, and we've actually put some thought into that. So where are we today? Well, if you haven't signed up for our Blue Button API, you are not one of the 750 organizations that already have. And, you know, there's some of the really big names in the industry. We have applications live today, as again, Randy and people like BeWell demonstrated just yesterday. And at the individual developer level, we're over 1,100 developers, and it keeps going up every week. So it's a really vibrant community, but it really builds off what HL7 has done with FHIR. I'm too lazy. That's why I love FHIR, because I didn't want to invent another API. I often joke CMS is really good at it, but they're usually called comma-separated variable files. So I think we're at the last slide. We may even have a minute or two for questions. Look at that, 2 minutes to go. Anne-Marie, was there anything else you wanted to say? But bluebutton.cms.gov, you can go there today, sign up for free. Go do it, or come talk to me afterwards.
So the last thing I'll say is just trying to put this in the context of broader policy that's going on right now in the government. And I think as you consider the ability to share data, not only, I mentioned earlier, the broader consumer choice and more engagement with their healthcare and things like their health savings accounts, but in addition, care coordination. It really takes on an entirely new level when you've got the patient able to facilitate that and play a role there. And so as we're thinking about the transition to value-based payments, and I know this isn't the audience for that, but again, it's the work that you all are doing in order to make this possible is fitting in and providing the foundation for a lot of other changes as well.
Yeah, I can give you one last example. I was actually responding to our Google group this morning where people saying, ACO, can you get data into the EHR? Well, ACOs get a lot of data. There's so much data about us, without us in the industry today. But the problem is CMS has this attribution process where they eventually decide that this provider is caring for you, therefore we'll give them data. That's really the core of the accountable care organization work that they do. But imagine that you're diagnosed with renal disease or cancer and you go to a specialist, and they're going to get attributed in maybe a couple of months. But you, as a patient, could say, here, have my claims information. Now you can take an assessment of what diagnoses they've seen, what medications they've been on for the last 3 or 4 years, so they can immediately start to refine that care plan specific to you, rather than have to guess, or you have to fill in those interminable forms, right? So even if we sort out improved data transfer going on using FHIR or whatever, there's still a really important role for patients to play in sharing their data. And I'll stop now, Wayne. Thank you.